Camera speed.
Nelson George, Finding the Funk, take 3.
It's gonna start. It's Sly Stone's classic Stand album. I mean, you know, the idea of multiracial and multicultural is a very important part of why that was such an important group. Freddie, this is his brother, played guitar. Sister Rose was his sister in the band. Larry Graham played bass. Cynthia, great sax player and trumpet. Greg Errico, who was a fantastic drummer, really underrated, amazing drummer. And Jerry Martini, who played sax. So it's white, black, Puerto Rican, everybody just a freaking. Way before Prince. Sly was really pushing the envelope on all this. So when you look at Prince and what Prince kind of conceived, I mean, this is the blueprint right here with Sly. So what's the next
Wait,
question?
Did you get that? Did you get the tights?
A little bit, yeah.
Okay.
Go
Can
ahead.
you get that again? Just
Which
point,
thing?
when you open the album thing, just point to the different.
There's a bit of a glare off the lights.
Yeah, I
There we
figured.
go, right there. Okay, do the pointing, just kind of like one at a time. Mm-hmm. Hold it up about an inch. There you go. Got it? Okay, good.
I'm changing my boom station.
Next,
Am I okay here, Diane? Okay.
No.
No? Where's the frame line? Is it?
I'm trying to go wider on these shots because I want to see the light. That's good.
That's okay? Okay.
what's the next question?
Actually, 2 inches down. Thank you.
So what does Afrofuturism have to do with funk music?
A big part of what funk was and became was not simply about earthbound, even though funk is the most rooted idea, you know, funky. These bands in that era and onward would deal with futurism and the idea that black people were in the space, so to speak. One of the things that's interesting is that a lot of what funk came out of was the 70s, right? Era of Star Wars, E.T., this whole idea of there was a big explosion in science fiction out of Hollywood. But there was a big complaint among black folks that, you know, we weren't represented enough or weren't represented fairly. People of color weren't in the future. That was a big issue. But if you go all the way back to a guy named Sun Ra, he was an avant-garde jazz musician of the 50s. But Sun Ra really dealt with the idea. I mean, if you go to pictures of his stage show, he had pyramids on stage. He had space outfits. He had dancers. He had these very elaborate stage shows. But the elaborate stage shows were really aimed at the idea of future, and also he dealt with Egypt and the idea that, you know, the Egyptians were from another place. Maybe they were extraterrestrials. And so while his music was not commercial in any form, the ideas of his stage show and his visionary way of thinking about music and its relationship to the future and to people of color really resonated with people. So people like George Clinton and Maurice White of Earth, and Fire, who went on to do these incredibly elaborate stage shows, the root of those stage shows are really in Sun Ra. And this idea, so when you look at, if you went to see P-Funk, the famous Mothership coming to land, right? If you went to see Earth, and Fire, they had pyramids on stage. They had people who had Doug Henning illusions where the band would disappear and pop up on another side of the stage. The drum kit would spin around in midair. All of the funk bands were very much about how do I push the envelope? And a lot of it had to do with futuristic imagery at a time when mainstream media wasn't really projecting black people into the future. So that thread about the future and science fiction and black culture, you can go from Sun Ra to all these great funk bands to Outkast and see what Andre 3000 was doing. Janelle Monáe and how she envisions herself as a future android. God, there's so many, anybody who comes through who's in progressive music today, it may not be traditional funk music, but any black artist who's kind of pushing the envelope on the imagery of black style, a lot of it goes right through funk because these guys really took the idea of what the image of black people would be and really pushed it. I mean, one of the big threads in talking about Parliament Funkadelic is Pedro Bell. Their album covers were like these huge, you pulled them open and they were a whole world. They were cartoons. They were social commentary. They were science fiction. They were funny as hell. They were nasty. They were a little rude. And that idea, so funk again was about pushing the envelope, not simply musically and not even simply in terms of social life now, but into the future. And that idea of a black vision of the future that involved Africa, that involved Egypt, that involves Earthlings going into space. Funk was really, really, really ambitious about that. And it's one thing that separated both from soul, and it separated to a great degree from what came out later with hip hop, in the sense that hip hop was very much concerned with the hood here for the most part. Those people who were doing these records and this music were pushing the envelope into space.
So, what did technology change for funk music?
Well, in the early '80s, a number of devices came in: the 808 drum machine, the Fairlight computer, and just all these other kind of drum machines. There was a raft of technology that came into the recording process. So you saw bands change. For example, Cameo. Okay, this is their Alligator Woman album. It has actually it's probably not one of their biggest records, but very interesting in terms of the progression. So this is actually Vanity 6, an early incarnation of her as the Alligator Woman. So Cameo in this incarnation has 5 members, right? The original band that was a big hit, because they had many hits before this album, had as many as 11 people on stage, like 3-man horn section, percussion. But with the technology, the bands themselves in funk began to shrink. You didn't really need as many horns because you used keyboards to make the horn sounds. You could use drum machines to create different rhythm patterns. So the band, you'd have a guitar player and you'd have some vocalists. But the idea of what a band was began to change and shrink because the technology allowed you to do more things. So the very sound of funk changed. Earth, Wind & Fire, which had been like 9 members, shrunk. Almost every one of the bands that had been big funk bands in the 70s, then transitioned into the 80s and were successful, got smaller and changed their sound to reflect the fact that the drum sound was different. And so also how you did bass lines was different. You still had to have a good bass line, but maybe the bass line wasn't on a live bass anymore. Maybe it was done on a keyboard. So that was a profound change in how funk changed and how all pop music changed. Also, the idea of precision. When you had these live bands, it was much looser. The groove was kind of looser. The drum machine thing it was such a precise sound and locked in sound that you began finding that the songs had a different tempo and a different kind of, they were still funky, but they felt different. They didn't feel as organic. And that was a big change. And Cameo is one of the bands that actually really benefited from the change. They had a lot of black hits when they were just a bigger funk group. They were able to cross on have big pop hits in the 80s in the new era. And one of the things, Larry Blackman, who was a leader of the band and quite a interesting cat, he went from just being another guy in a everyone used to wear these crazy suits with their the shirts off and lacings and legs up, and he switched and put a red codpiece over his genitals, and that look became the look of the band. If you see videos like Candy, he made himself, and also in the era of video, he created a new image for himself. He got a high top fade, he got a red codpiece, and suddenly he's playing a heavy rotation on MTV. So the bands had to be visionary. They also had to be, how do I keep moving forward? How do I continue to be true to being raw and being funky, but in this new era? And Cameo was one of the bands that really figured it out really well.
That goes into the next question. What is hip hop? What has hip hop taken from funk music?
I mean, there is no hip hop without funk music. It's quite as simple as that. And we're not just talking about, James Brown, yes. P-Funk, yes. But what was really interesting about hip hop is that the crate digging concept. I'm going to find beats that no one else has. So some of the biggest samples in hip hop are from more obscure funk bands that maybe had one hit, maybe had 2 hits. But the people who were in hip hop that were really geniuses at finding the right loops and finding the right records to loop and change up to create their records. The Beastie Boys were very visionaries. That Prince Paul De La, very visionary with that. Obviously, Public Enemy was very visionary with that. And then you'd have the West Coast, where you have a different use. Well, where the New York MCs and producers took certain loops and looped them over to create these sounds. Out in LA, Warren G and Dr. Dre, who were relatives, created a thing called G-Funk. And the idea of G-Funk was to take these loops, but not just chop them up the way they did in New York, but to let them play out almost. In many cases, they use real musicians. So they take samples and use real musicians. There's a guy named Colin Wolfe, who's a bass player out of LA, who was the bass player, Deep Cover, G Thing on all these records. So they not only took the samples, but they also created their own textures. And the G-Funk felt more like real funk because there was a human element to it, I think. And those records, in many ways, what's really ironic is that some of the biggest hits of the G-Funk era, as they would say, took records from funk bands that weren't as successful and took some of the same musical elements and put them in the top 10 on the Billboard chart. So hip-hop was able to take funk to a place that funk itself could not go to in terms of crossover. It's really an ironic thing. And in some cases, some of the funketeers benefited really, really well from this. I mean, Ice Cube in particular went out of his way to, and he even did a video where he used images from the Mothership landing and P-Funk to create his video. So their kinship between the West Coast and the real funketeers was very strong. If you go see Snoop Dogg right now, his band is a West Coast funk band. It's a live band, and he's even used members from some of the old funk bands in his group. So the connection between funk never died. It morphed. It smelled different, but it was still there.
So what has underfunding of music education, how has that hurt funk?
Well, starting with the Reagan era, the early 80s, you saw this whole idea that music wasn't for a lot of people in terms of funding education, it wasn't a core thing. And so over the last 20 years, music education in public schools has gotten worse and worse and worse. There's not most schools don't have regular teachers every day, music every day. They might have a part-time. The actual equipment in most public music schools, if you go to Brooklyn or Detroit, Chicago, some of these big cities that had spawned tremendously gifted musicians. You go into the music room, if they have working instruments, if they have a tuned piano, it's a miracle. So what you see is there's a lot of kids who come up now who can play, an 808 or 808 sample or digital file. They can create music digitally, but really don't understand theory, don't understand how to compose music in a traditional sense. Because funk was very much a band music, even as even with the smaller groups, it was a band music and interplay music. There's no tradition. The kids are cut off from that tradition of music. So you have this remarkable, strange effect that the fact is, if I want to go see a great young funk band in New York tonight, I'm probably going to see a white band. I'm probably going to see mostly guys who a lot of them are from New Orleans. There's a big, strong tradition of New Orleans. But most of the bands that play funk in New York City, let's say today, are white bands who have musical training, have skills, who grew up in a tradition of funk as a music-based, band-based experience, where you don't have kids in a lot of different parts of this country now, black kids, who have that band experience. So it's a really profound change from even the mid-'80s, over 20 years or so to now, to see that difference. Bands like Galactic, Soul Live, there's a whole bunch of them that play on the jam. And what's interesting also, the jam band circuit. Now, a lot of people think of the jam band circuit as kind of a proto-hippie circuit, bands like Fish. But in fact, if you go see any jam band, there's a funk element to what they're doing. Almost all of the bands use funk in some form. And in fact, I went to see this show the other night at the Brooklyn Bowl, and there's this white chick in the crowd going, "We want the funk. Gotta have that funk." I was like, what? How does she even know this record? And she was like 25 years old. So funk lives, but it lives in different ways. One more thing I want to hit on is brass bands. One of the interesting phenomena of the jam band era and now in the 21st century is that brass bands from New Orleans, this Soul Rebel Band, Rebirth Brass Band, I mean, there's tons of them, tour the country, often with the bass played by a tuba, right? But they are some of the funkiest bands going right now. And this is ironic again, is that if you want to see black bands, a lot of them, a community that plays funk, you're going to see a brass band from New Orleans. And it's these ironies of history, how things happen in ways you never expect. They have so they still have the live band sound, very attacking brass sound, but also they have a real deep funk groove. And the New Orleans musicians and the New Orleans groove in general is one of the most unique beats ever. I mean, it comes out of second line funerals, it comes out of jazz, and that beat influenced James Brown. It influenced the creation of funk. And one of the interesting things about this, if you took a map, you could go from the South, you could go from Macon, where James Brown is, or go from right up the Mississippi River from New Orleans. Then you stop in the Midwest, and you hit Dayton, you hit Cincinnati, you hit Chicago, you hit Detroit. So this idea of funk, like it traveled, while there's great funk in New York and great funk in LA, there's a strong core. The heart of it is really that Midwest.
You shared about this a little bit, but what is the state of funk now?
Okay, let me hit one more thing. Let's talk about.
Okay.
You guys ready? This is Purple Rain. I think you know the album by Prince, 1984. And one of the interesting things again about Prince is an inheritor of funk, and it's interesting that as he's gotten older, he's embraced funk even more and more deeply. You know, Purple Rain's his crossover record. It was a huge movie, obviously. But he comes out of this community of musicians that came out of Minneapolis. That was the time. He was in a band actually early on with Morris Day and Andre Simone, who later was in his band. There was a whole band scene in Minneapolis that people didn't know about. At the time that I remember interviewing Prince in 1981, and he basically, as he did at the time, lied a lot. He said there were no black people in Minnesota. There's no music in Minnesota. I did it all myself. I lived in a little room. He said Jamie Starr, whose credit was producing a lot of his records, wasn't him, but it was him. And no one, and we were in New York. We had no idea what was going on in Minneapolis. We just took him at his word until we went out there and realized that he was pulling our leg, which he did a lot. So there was a whole scene, a tradition of music out of Minneapolis that was very funky. And, you know, the way there's jams on every Prince album. That's, you know, Let's Work, early record. There's so many of these records that are straight up funk records. When he did The Time became his outlet for his funk records. But even then, I remember when I interviewed Morris Day when he first came to New York, they said they weren't a funk band. Because they would just, anything that they had to do to make themselves different from everyone else, they were really smart about. But in fact, The Time was a progressive funk band. In a sense, Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis on bass and keyboards brought the funk. The keyboard, I mean, the vibe of The Time was kind of a slicked out version. They went away from the crazy outfits, the crazy space outfits, but to a very slick, always pimply gangster look. But it was funk. And he used them as an outlet for that part of himself. So Prince is, and to this day, Prince is now, when you go see Prince now, Prince is one of the few connections that's still big between the funk of the 70s and James Brown and Sly to the 21st century. So if you see Prince, you're seeing one of the last giants of funk music. And he's 50 some odd years old and can still bring it like nobody's business. Okay, I'm gonna hit a couple more records. Can you see this? Okay. When disco became big in New York City, you know, people said, well, disco is a different thing from everything. Disco is its own thing. But in fact, the foundation of a band like Chic was one of the really great dance bands of the 70s and 80s. Nile Rodgers on guitar, Bernard Edwards on bass, Tony Thompson on drums, a fantastic group. If you listen to the instrumental tracks, we call it disco, right? But in fact, there's a heavy, heavy funk overlay. to wait. Niall's guitar parts are all out of James Brown school. Bernard's bass lines take from Graham, take from Bootsy, and put his own stamp on it. So, but because they market themselves as disco, because that's what time it was, they were able to camouflage the fact that they were tied into the style and move forward. Excuse me. Good Times is a funk record. Do 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 do. You take the funk and then you add it on, and it becomes hip hop through Rapper's Delight. So Chic, then throughout this whole thing of this last few years, last couple of decades, that funk hasn't disappeared. But what has happened is that elements of it have been fused onto many, many different styles of music. I want to pull out a couple more. Do I have that here?